Hey everybody, it's Monday night. It's been a while. Excuse me, it's been a while since I posted some videos. I've been pretty busy, um, but I did over the weekend go and see the Napoleon movie, the Ridley Scott Napoleon movie, and I just when I went in, I was sort of thinking like, okay, are they gonna pull him off as an ENTJ because Napoleon's probably one of the few people, like famous people out there, where there's sort of a general consensus that he's an ENTJ, even though, most of us who do this typology stuff have really no idea what his real personality was. We just sort of know what he did in general. Um, but I thought it'd be interesting to see, does he was he such an ENTJ that even if they weren't trying to make him an ENTJ, did he come across as an ENTJ, right? Because I have no idea if Ridley Scott or Joaquin Phoenix, knows that everybody thinks of him as an ENTJ or anything like that. But um, I thought it'd be interesting to see if he was just so such a classic ENTJ that you just can't help for him to come out as an ENTJ when you make a movie about the guy. Um, so just fair warning, there's going to be spoilers about the movie. Now, of course, the movie is presumably his history, so much of what happens in the movie is sort of somewhat general knowledge. But they take certain make certain choices of what to pay attention to and what not to pay attention to and the way to present things that I'm going to sort of talk about. So if you haven't seen the movie and you don't want it spoiled, you might want to wait on this video. Okay. So let's see. So when I was trying to figure out, like, okay, is he coming across as an ENTJ? The first thing I was thinking, or the first thing I wanted to look for, was does he come across as SI polar? Because if you're an ENTJ, that's going to be your SI is going to be your polar function, and again, I'm not trying to say that they intentionally did any of this stuff, but if they did any sort of background in his personality, other sort of SI polar types of things that he did. And I'm going to get into a few of those because there's some like really famous things that Napoleon did that were probably probably come across as SI polar in just sort of a cosmic sense, right? Not little mannerisms or ticks of behavior, which we'll also talk about, but grand, historical things, things that drove history that probably extended from him being SI polar in one sense or another. And so that's why I think there's a pretty good case that he was an ENTJ. Aside from the fact that he was sort of this brilliant mastermind, military strategist, which he definitely was, but he did some grandiose SI polar things, which I'm gonna get to later. So that's sort of the cliffhanger there to keep you on the hook. But let's talk about more sort of just personality quirks, little behaviorisms that they showed in the movie. And I want to get your sense, especially, for those of you who have seen the movie, you know, what was your sense of his, psychological type or personality type? Did he come across as an ENTJ? Did he come across as something else? And there were two things that stuck out to me that they were really sort of focusing on with his personality. Um, Number one, he came across as just overly aggressive, um, but but in a really clumsy way, right? Not in a kind of Donald Trump, you know, just trying to be in the spotlight so much as he was really clunky. Like there's all kinds of scenes of him like breaking glasses and kicking over chairs and like dropping swords. And it's not because he's clumsy in sort of a buffoonish or clownish way, but it's because like he'll get riled up about something and he'll get overly excited, and he'll just like break a glass because he's just so pissed off, or he'll kick over a chair because he's so pissed off, and he just has this sort of disregard for the objects that are around him. And I think that was probably an intentional choice because it keeps happening like all the time. So it was clearly some sort of intentional choice either by Joaquin Phoenix or Ridley Scott or the both of them, where it was sort of like this symbolism or this manifestation of him being sort of overly aggressive, and just and then historically he's known as being overly aggressive, taking it too far, and then having everything sort of collapse underneath him because he just sort of took it too far, right? And so I think all these little clunky behaviors of his where he's sort of, breaking glasses, kicking over chairs, dropping swords, doing just this clunky type of behavior is supposed to be a little micro representation of his over aggressiveness and how he's sort of careless with what he's doing. So that was one thing that I noticed. And one of the big historic things that they point out is when he when he's going to his coronation, right? So they sort of wanted to make him a king. He opts for the term emperor because there's all well, you'll see the movie or read the history, you'll see why, but they basically needed to find one person who was going to be sort of the seat of power. And so it ended up being him, and they made him the emperor. So they had this big coronation scene, and as far as I know, this is historically accurate. All the videos that I've seen with the historians talking about it say that it's pretty accurate. And so they're going to crown him, and he goes up to kneel, and then the Catholic bishop, or maybe it was the Pope, it was probably the Pope, is about to crown him, and he just stands up, takes the crown out of the guy's hand, and then puts it on his own head, right? And that's the classic narcissistic Napoleon, like it was very symbolic because he's basically saying, look, not even the Pope has power over me, not even the church has power over me. I am going to crown myself emperor. But the way they did it, again, I mean, they could have made it very regal. They could have made it very, sort of just, grandiose and elegant in a way. They could have made it that way, but instead it's just very clunky. Like even the sound of it just sounds clunky. You just hear this like old metal crown just sort of rattling, and he just sort of clumsily puts it on his head. It's sort of hanging there, and he just sort of gives this little speech, but in a very, again, clumsy kind of way, about finding the crown in the gutter and lifting it up with his sword. And I don't know if that's actually what he said, probably, but it all came across as just like clumsy and clunky. And it was certainly intentional because, like, the framing of it, the sound, the way Joaquin Phoenix was playing it, it was all intentional. They were trying to make him just look like this overly aggressive guy that just had no sort of grace or style, right? Some people have criticized Joaquin Phoenix's performance as being almost autistic. And I don't think it really comes across as autistic. I don't think that was necessarily the angle. It's really just kind of clunky and overly aggressive, kind of crude. They very brutish, brute, brute, not brood, but brute. And they refer, and they all the characters were kept referring to him as a brute and just sort of this classless, not really a buffoon, but just didn't have any manners and was just kind of overly aggressive. Okay. So does that come across as SI polar, right? I don't know. I mean, I'm going to get into it in a little bit, but there was another personality quirk that I wanted to point out as well. And then I'm going to sort of circle back to whether it comes out as SI polar or not, or how all these things sort of shake out. The other thing that they really were hammering home with his personality is he was just so socially awkward when it came to Josephine, his wife, and when he first met her, and he is just remarkably socially awkward. Like he just can't stop staring at her. He can barely get any words out when he's talking to her, and even when they're married, he just has these really bizarre mannerisms. Like when he's like trying to hook up with her, he just sort of like starts like mewing like a horse or something. It was really bizarre, and just like almost creepy, but in a really socially awkward kind of way. And and this was, I think, pretty spot on for Napoleon historically, because he was sort of this was a very infamous relationship, him and Josephine, and where everybody in the world just sort of knew that Josephine was taking advantage of this guy because she came from the aristocracy, and during the French Revolution she was actually, I think she was put in prison. They make a reference to it in the movie, and her family, like her parents, I think had been killed. And the only reason she didn't get killed is because she got pregnant in prison, or at least that's what they sort of allude to. And then, she gets out, and the revolution, the terror where they're killing all the aristocrats in France, it sort of subsided, but she still wasn't safe, right? Like you never knew what was going to happen. And so she sort of latches on to Napoleon because he's part of the Revolutionary Guard and he's an officer, and so she probably felt like, okay, he's safe and my kids will be safe if I latch on to this guy, and he's probably pretty easy to, get my hooks into. And so she was sort of famous for kind of taking advantage of the guy. But it's a real interesting dynamic between the two. At least in the movie, they play it off as she, eventually had some feelings for him, but it was always kind of a weird thing. But Napoleon just sort of seemed like oblivious to it all, right? Like he just thought, oh, this lady loves me. And just, quite frankly, came across as very FE polar in that respect. Very just kind of acting INTJ, ISTJ when it comes to that kind of social dynamic where everybody else in the room sort of understands what's going on and he doesn't. And so part of it, he sort of comes across as an INTJ and, in a large part of the movie because of this social awkwardness. Now, all that being said, I mean, you could easily say, okay, maybe that's sort of fourth function FI, where he, is having, if he were an ENTJ, fourth function FI, where he's just kind of knows what he wants, but he, is kind of doesn't like being put on the spot, that kind of fourth function stuff. And I don't know if FE in the A slot would come across as that oblivious, to what was going on, or just that socially awkward. But just in the way that he was clunky with objects around him, like breaking glasses, kicking over chairs, he was just kind of clunky with her, right? Like he thought he was being suave, he thought he was being debonair, but he was just being weird, right, for lack of a better term. So that was a real interesting, part of his personality, and I think there's some historical backing to it because there's sort of these famous love letters that Napoleon would write Josephine, and she just never opened them and never read them. And, and then like, later the historians read them all. And that, and so not only was she just like not even reading his letters, but the letters were apparently, I haven't seen them, but now I kind of want to, but they're apparently very kind of awkward and like him just sort of professing his love in these very awkward kind of ways. And so he probably was very awkward with her, socially awkward with her, and just didn't really know how to interact. There's also some weird mommy stuff going on. He had with him, he had sort of a not really dominant mom, but he was a mama's boy, and he wanted to sort of please his mom, or sort of impress her a lot, and so that might have played into it. I don't know, but so going back to the SI polar thing, right? So can you make a case that this clunky behavior, or just Napoleon in general, was sort of an SI person? And the clunkiness sort of, and the clumsiness sort of comes across as more SE polar, right? But I guess you could make a case of him being SI polar in the sense that, well, I'd be interested in hearing people's theories on this. But I've never really thought of SI polar as being sort of clunky, over aggressive, but maybe it's just sort of a general sense, like just not really having a sense of his surroundings in any sort of homeopathic sense, or homeostasis sense. And one thing about SI polars is they don't really care about their comfort all that much. And maybe because of that, they might be a little bit sort of clunky or overly aggressive, because they're just not really sort of, having that balance or that match with their environment, and the way that you do when you take warm baths, or snuggle up in a blanket, that kind of thing. You're sort of connecting your body to the environment. I don't know, maybe there's something to it, or maybe there's nothing to it, and this was just sort of a filmmaking motif where they were trying to sort of foreshadow his bigger clunky mistakes that he ended up making. And those are, now getting back to those, are more of the historic SI polar things that I think you can kind of point to and be like, okay, he had something going on. And if you think of SI as sort of a couple of things, it's that sort of being sort of comfortable in your environment, sort of an internal comfort, but it's also just sort of learning from your experience, right? And learning, not only from your experience, but other people's experience that, you've been taught along the years. Sorry, I just get a little notification here. Okay. So first of all, going back to that coronation scene, right? There's no way an ISTJ or an ESTJ or any sort of SJ is going to stand up and grab the crown out of the Pope's hand and coronate themselves, right? Because they're rule followers, and that's a big part of being an SJ is, that introverted sensing is your sort of sense of the rules. And again, you have the knowledge base of what the rules are, but not only that, but by following the rules and having that sort of reliability and stability built into those rules, you yourself feel internally more comfortable, right? So an ISTJ or an ESTJ is, put in that sort of coronation situation, they're going to feel comfortable, but when they're sort of, following the tradition, sitting there and having the Pope crown you, that probably makes them feel comfy inside on that SI kind of sense, because it matches up with their expectation of the world and the way that things work. Where Napoleon, if he's SI polar, like none of that stuff matters. None of that tradition, ritual, any of that stuff, like it doesn't make him feel comfortable. Like he doesn't care. Like he's just sort of like, I've got to show the world that I'm the emperor. And, there were a lot of things going on in other countries that, were sort of threatening them at the time. And so he had to show this sort of big show of force that, I'm the guy in charge here. And so, sort of relying on tradition and following the rules just wasn't going to work for him. He had bigger plans. Um, so in that sense, I think you could, point to him being SI polar there. The other thing that he is, one of the things he's most famous for is, they end up going to war with Russia. And so he invades Russia and they march all the way up to Moscow. Moscow, gets abandoned and the Russians burn it down. They're basically like, we'd rather burn our city down than surrender to you. And they all go up to St. Petersburg, the Russians. And so it's the dead of winter. It's like December, right? And Napoleon's like, okay, well, we're just going to follow them up to St. Petersburg and we'll catch them there. And we'll just keep following them until we get them. And everybody around him is like, it's the dead of winter in Russia. Like, we're all going to freeze to death. None of us are equipped for this. Let's just, take a breather, wait it out, and, we'll regroup in the spring, and then we'll go after them when the weather's much nicer. No, Napoleon with his SI polar and not really thinking about the fact that everybody's going to freeze to death because it's so damn cold up there, decides, no, we're just going to keep going, right? And again, that's a very SI polar thing because it's just sort of bucking, the trend and the traditions and the well-established rules of you don't invade Russia in the winter. Lots of people have learned that lesson the hard way, including Napoleon. But also just sort of this sense of like, it's cold, right? I'm SI polar. Like, what do I care? Because again, they don't have that sort of, wanting to be comfy kind of sense. They just go, go, go. And so he's probably thinking, well, hey, everybody's like me. We'll just toughen it out. So of course it was a historically, large blunder by Napoleon. They lost a lot of troops. They, just to the cold, not even to like battle or anything. And so they ended up, exiling him because they're just like, okay, you've taken it too far. This is clearly getting to your head. And, you're making these sort of bizarre decisions, and again, like he was this master tactician, this master, he had the military strategy, he had a mastery of it, right? Master strategist. That's the word I'm looking for. So you put him in a, I guess, normal battlefield condition, like, he can wipe the face off of any other army. But, you put him in these situations where it's like the SI polar catches up with him and he's just sort of detached from not the SE reality, but the SI reality in this sense. And, it ends up, costing him his crown. Now, of course, he gets banned to Elba, and of course, he can't, he can't just retire and live out his days because I guess if you're SI polar, like you don't want to just sit around, drinking, scotch or rum all day and smoking cigars and just hanging out, right? Or working in the garden or doing all these SI kind of things. He's just like, I got to go back and start kicking ass again. And so, he couldn't be comfortable, in really any sort of situation unless he's just driving to accomplish something more. And I think, that's probably the ENTJ part of him, right? Is that he just could not stop with, continually trying to drive and get more and more and more. And really, his only sort of focal point, his only sort of focus was Josephine, and she didn't really like him all that much. And there was also a whole issue where she couldn't get pregnant, and because now that he's the emperor, he needed an heir, so that was a whole tension thing. But even with her, where his wife is supposed to give him those warm and fuzzy SI type of feelings, he could just never really get that with her. And it was probably, again, it comes across as very FE socially awkward, like FE polar socially awkward. But I think now that I think about it a little bit more, it could be characterized more as a sort of an SI thing where he just was always just sort of, fidgety and clunky and clumsy and just couldn't really just be comfortable. He couldn't just chill out and like hang out with her. Every time he was with her, there was just some sort of drama, right? And it came across as him being very sort of physically awkward and uncomfortable. And maybe there's something to that in the SI world. So those are just my rough thoughts. Again, I'm, to some extent, I'm trying to put the square or, the circle in the square hole, right? I'm trying to make the data fit the theory here rather than the theory fit the data. But it is sort of interesting to think about, especially since Napoleon seems to be one of the few figures in history that most people sort of agree that he's an ENTJ. Now, I'm sure there's some people out there that, think otherwise, but, the general consensus seems to be ENTJ. And so for those of you who have seen the movie or seen snippets of it, let me know what you think. Do ENTJs come across as socially awkward in this way? I never really thought of them as being socially awkward, but maybe there's something there. Especially if you sort of tie it to an uneasiness with the SI and not so much an inability to use their FE. It's more of just this kind of physical uneasiness or awkwardness that maybe they were getting at. And again, I don't think they necessarily were trying to make him an ENTJ. I just think that Napoleon was probably just such an ENTJ that, if you knew anything about his personality and anything about his mannerisms or his behaviors, it's probably going to come out, as being very ENTJ-like. So interested in your thoughts. Let me know what you think. If you haven't seen the movie, it's pretty good. I mean, you should see it if you like history, if you like Napoleon. They don't really spend a whole lot of time talking about the war stuff or the strategy stuff or like the NT kind of part of Napoleon. They focus way more on his sort of weird relationship with Josephine and his kind of weird social awkwardness, to be honest. But it was good. Joaquin Phoenix is always good. He's always fun to watch. And the lady who plays Josephine is just awesome. I'm sure she'll get an Academy Award or at least nominated for it. She's really good at it. Okay. Talk to everybody later. Let me know your thoughts. Good night.